Welcome to the Helpful Pharmacist, a weekly live podcast. My name is Chris Regas. I am the Helpful Pharmacist, and today we're going to be talking about, you guessed it, all things health. This is a live stream, so for those of us following along live, feel free to put any questions in the chat box here. The real goal here is to engage and be able to provide individualized information. And so again, if you have any comments, questions, concerns, anything that is pertaining specifically to your life, please put that in so we can include that. I do have a presentation to go over today, so I will also be going over my own topic. I have what I think is an interesting topic today for you guys. It's what I would do on a daily basis if I was diabetic. And I think that's an interesting perspective. And the idea is to kind of provide some information that, again, is easier to digest, more understandable, and especially more practical. So a lot of people talk about there's theorists and practitioners, and a lot of times the theorists get it wrong because they don't actually follow their own advice. So today, part of the idea is to follow our own advice, or at least provide information more so of what I would do, how I would do it, and all that stuff. So let's get this started. Let me just get all my screen set up here. Okay, cool. Oh. Almost pushed the wrong button there. That would have been bad. Cool, so again, I am going to be going off some slides today. I think hopefully it helps you guys engage a little bit more and gives you something else besides me to look at. So the title for today is If I Was Diabetic, What I Would Do. I think this is actually a really interesting angle on it. I don't think I've ever heard anyone really talk about it like this. And so I think you guys are really going to like it, and it's going to provide some information. Again, this is who I am. So again, the goal for today is to change things up a bit. And I want to really share, like I said, what I would do with my diet, my lifestyle, my medications if I was diabetic. And I do want to preface here, this is going to be primarily type 2 diabetes. I think the overwhelming majority of what I'm going to say today fits for type 1, but there are some subtle differences, so I just want to disclaimer that. If you're watching this and you are type 1 diabetic, there may be a few little things here or there that may be slightly different, obviously for medication. But I think for diet, exercise, lifestyle, mindset, things to avoid, those should all be relatively the same. So I just want to disclaimer that. So again, I think what's interesting, why isn't this fully expanded out? 1 second here, let me get this. It's weird, it's not all the way expanded. Anyways, so what I want to talk about first is diet. And I want to keep it as simple as possible. And what I really like to focus on when I educate patients on this is what I like to call the idea behind the decisions and not just the decisions. So what I mean by that is a lot of times people will tell you, don't do this, don't do that, do this. And they're really just giving you a set of decisions that are made for you. If A, go to B, if B, go to C, so on and so forth. And I don't think that really works for a lot of people. People don't like being told what to do. Everyone's lifestyle is different. And what may work for you may not work for somebody else. And so if they're telling you the actual things to do and they don't work for you, it's not very helpful. Versus what I like to do is give people a little bit more of the understanding, a little bit of the background, a little bit of the thought process, so then you can actually start making your own decisions and you can apply that information to your own life, which is going to give you the most personal, individualized information, but also more importantly, it's going to be sustainable. Because if you don't like what you're doing, if you don't like the changes, they're really not going to be very useful or practical. And so again, if we can teach you how to make your own decisions, you're typically going to make the decisions you like. And again, it makes it easier to follow your own advice. So I think that's an important concept. To start off with, I do want to include the overall concept that diabetes in a lot of ways is a disease of diet. And that's where a lot of the work, if not most of the work, occurs. It's typically people eating too many carbs, too many processed foods, too much food, eating too often type things that are causing their blood sugar to become elevated, and again, potentially causing them to be insulin resistant or not be able to make enough insulin, which again are typically the hallmarks of type 2 diabetes. Again, diabetics typically don't make enough insulin. The reason why is they made too much and now they can't make enough. And the reason why they made too much in the beginning was because they became resistant. Their body was overexposed to insulin and it kind of got tired of it, so had to make more. And that's why they end up insulin resistant and unable to make enough insulin, just to kind of throw that in for a quick full foundation. Again, the goal is to prevent the blood sugar from spiking after a meal. We want the blood sugar to be in a normal range, which is typically between 100 and 140. When we eat, it does go up, and we want it to come back down as soon as possible. Again, that is the peak and also the postprandial. And then a common question, again, for the conversation is, how do we do this? And when we can't do this, why? Like, what do we do to fix this, or why are we not accomplishing it? So I think this is a really great illustration that I think covers a lot of these points. It also gives people an idea to make sure they understand the terms properly. So you can kind of see my cursor here a little bit. I can't make it any bigger. But this is basically a meal. So you eat, and after 1 or 2 hours, or 60 minutes in this case, your blood sugar peaks. So you can see these are the peaks, and between the red line and the green line. And it's also illustrating that in a normal person, it would be this level, but when we don't make enough insulin, or we're not sensitive enough, it gets higher. So again, this is why the peak is an issue, because it's elevated. And then it shows that not only is it elevated, but those two lines over time, they never cross. So in a perfect world for these diabetes patients, maybe their peak is a little bit higher, but after a couple hours, those lines would cross, which means that the blood sugars are basically normal. Again, they don't do that because of the postprandial. So postprandial is the shape of the curve after the peak, and how long it takes after a meal for the body to go back to normal. So in the case of diabetes or prediabetes, both the peak and the postprandial are impaired or impacted. And so these are really the two things that we're trying to control with diet especially. So if we don't understand what the goals are, if we don't understand some of that thought process, a lot of the terms, they don't make sense. And we can't intuitively understand how the decisions we're making causes those issues, causes those complications, or impacts those issues, or causes the problems. So I want to start with a slide to again illustrate the difference in the peaks, the difference in the postprandials, and what that looks like over time, because that's really what we're talking about here. And ultimately, the peak and the postprandial is very much determined by what you eat. Obviously, if you don't make enough insulin or you're insulin resistant, that's going to impair it further. But definitely diet is probably the number one, if not number one, a very close second place in terms of deciding these curves. So we have a lot of ability to control these curves with our diet, and that's going to be a big part of what we're talking about today. Also want to real quickly before we get into it, just talk about the value and the power of data. As you can see again with the prior slide, we wouldn't have the slide without data. And again, we're using this slide to illustrate some really interesting, important points. And we can also use this slide to understand how the food is a good decision or bad decision. So kind of repurposing the slide, instead of thinking the green one's normal and the red one's diabetic, let's instead think that these are from the same patient and they're different meals. And let's think of the green curve as being a healthy meal of primarily vegetables with some healthy fats and some lean meats. And let's think of the red top curve as maybe some processed food or some junk food or just a really carb-heavy meal. And so what we can also see is when we eat unhealthily, we're going to increase the peak, and that also requires longer for the postprandial return. So in terms of data, it really impacts us because it helps us understand which foods work. This food causes this peak, this food or this meal causes that peak, it causes this postprandial and vice versa, and we can get a better idea of which foods work and which foods don't work. And if we don't have that data, we're just guessing. Also want to mention that even if you're pricking your finger, you're really not getting that much data. I've personally done this where I pricked my finger 4 or 5 times a day for a couple of days to get an idea of where I was at. And then I wore a CGM or a Dexcom after, or at the same time, to see either how it compares or what information is different. I can tell you 100% in my experience, when I wore the CGM, the curve was completely different in terms of how I viewed it. And it gave me a lot more understanding, a lot more information. So again, we need the data to understand how the foods affect our body. And if we're not collecting that data, we're really at a major disadvantage. But then even with finger pricks, we're not really getting a lot of data. So I also just want to mention the value of the continuous glucose meters or the CGMs and why they're so powerful, using that prior slide as illustration. They typically have 3 versions right now. The Dexcom G7, which is prescription, the Libre 3, which is also prescription, and the Dexcom Stella, which doesn't require prescription, just came out. You can definitely get the Dexcom Stella right now through the Dexcom website. It's about $90 to $100 a month, depending if you subscribe. And so I think that's really valuable for people who can't get a prescription yet because they're not diagnosed as being diabetic, to again allow them to understand what their curves look like. And then let's say on Monday they have this for dinner, on Tuesday they have this for dinner, on Wednesday they have this for dinner. And they can compare those and say, okay, Wednesday's dinner was really bad, Monday's dinner was really good. I'm going to modify my diet based off that data. And then now you're making individualized decisions that are, again, going to lower your peak, lower your postprandial, and keep your A1C at a lower amount where it should be. So that's really what we're talking about. Again, I try not to mention terms that I haven't defined. So just real quick, A1C is a lab test you get. They take some blood, they put it into a machine, and it tells you for the last 90 days on average what your blood sugar was. And they give you a value. It's typically between 5 and 15. If it's under 5.7, that's considered at goal. If it's between 5.7 and 6.5, that's typically decided as being pre-diabetic. And anything over 6.5 to 7, depending on which criteria, is considered diabetic. So again, those meals directly contribute to the peaks, the postprandials, which directly contributes to the A1C. So it's to kind of link those together. So I also want to just quickly say again here that just how the body works. We eat food, it goes into our stomach, it digests this, we break it down, it gets absorbed into the blood. That's where the blood sugar comes from. Carbohydrates are a form of sugars, which is why we call it blood sugar, even though it's really carbohydrates. And you can also call it blood glucose. So whether you talk about blood sugar, blood glucose, or carbohydrates, they're all really the same thing, just so we understand those terms. And again, it's really that last step we're talking about today, which is you eat the food, it goes in your stomach, it breaks down, your body digests it, absorbs into the blood. And what we're going to start with here basically is that the longer it takes to absorb into the blood, the slower it takes, the slower it is, the lower the peak. And the lower the peak typically means the lower the postprandial. So one of the number one goals we have here is being a diabetic. If I'm a diabetic, okay, I'm talking about my food decisions. I want to eat meals that are really slow to digest. And I always want to pair my carbs with other things that slow my digestion. So that's really the number one thing I'm thinking about when it comes to my diet, is that I have to eat some carbs, but I need to pair those carbs with something else in order to offset the damage, which in this case would be the peak or the postprandial. And so we're gonna give some examples of that. So again, this is what I would do if I was diabetic. First thing is I definitely would wear a CGM, either if I had a prescription or I would wear it a couple times a year to collect that data. That helps me collect the data and understand where I'm at. Now we're talking about what actually affects the data. So the first one is actually fiber. Fiber is one of the best ways to slow the absorption of your food, which will lower your blood sugar after a meal. And that's because the more fiber a food has, the longer it takes to digest, which takes time, and that time basically slows the absorption. So you can think about if I put 100 grams of sugar into my blood immediately, how much my blood sugar rises, versus if I put 10 grams of sugar into my blood every 15 or 20 or 30 minutes, we can all intuitively understand that it's going to be more of a flat shape curve instead of a spike. That's kind of the goal we're going for here. So again, the first one is that fiber will slow the absorption, which will reduce the peak. It also helps you feel fuller for longer, which is really important, because one, if you overeat during that meal, you get that second portion, that's definitely going to spike your blood sugar or increase it more, or increase your postprandial for longer because you have more carbs, more blood sugar that you have to cover and reduce. But also I think from a weight management standpoint, it's really important because being overweight, having a BMI over 30 typically, is definitely a risk factor for diabetes and typically complicates it, as it does cardiovascular disease. And so if you feel fuller for longer, you're less likely to eat more or less likely to eat too soon. So for example, today I had a really big salad for lunch. It had to have at least 20 or 25 grams of fiber in it. I'm not gonna be full for hours. And oddly enough, the meal was actually pretty low calorie. It was probably 300 or 400 calories, which is actually on the low end for me. But because there's so much fiber in it, I'm probably not gonna get hungry for 5 or 6 hours. And when I do eat dinner, I'm gonna eat a pretty small meal. That's because of the fiber. So fiber is really powerful from a weight loss standpoint, a feeling full standpoint, and also from a standpoint of decreasing the rate of absorption, which will lower the peak and minimize the impact the carbs have on our blood sugar. Also want to really quickly include the idea of glycemic index, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But basically, as you increase fiber, you decrease the glycemic index, which is a good thing. So again, the glycemic index is basically a measure of how fast the carbs break down into our sugar, into our blood. And so the lower the glycemic index, the longer that takes. So it's just another way of saying the same thing. And we'll just jump ahead real quick. What is glycemic index? It is a numerical system that ranks carbohydrates in foods and how quickly they absorb into the sugar, into the blood, and raise the blood sugar after consumption, which is what we just talked about. So it's just a numerical way to quantify it, which can be really helpful. Typically, we want those carbs to be under 50 or 55 or 60. Lower is definitely better. And then typically any foods that have a glycemic index over 65 or definitely 75 either should be avoided or avoided almost altogether. So if you're eating something and the glycemic index is 80 or 85, if you're diabetic or worried about being diabetic or having problems with your blood sugar, basically you shouldn't put it in your body. And if you do, put a really small amount in. So it's a really great way for me or for patients to get access to a food list, because what you can do is you can go onto Google and you can type in glycemic index food list, or what's really cool is you can actually use ChatGPT now, go into ChatGPT and say provide 100 foods with a glycemic index under 55, and it'll pull it up for you. And so this is an example of where if you understand a little bit of the background, you can start making your own decisions, because now I'm not saying eat sweet potatoes and green beans and celery for every meal for the rest of your life. Instead, I can say, here's a list of 100 or 200 or 300 foods that all somewhat similarly are equally good from a blood sugar standpoint, and now you get to pick. So now you're empowered. Now you have all these options. You can say, well, I don't like this, I don't like this. Oh, wow, I actually really like this. I love carrots. I can eat carrots like twice a day, or I can eat carrots every single day. I'm gonna incorporate that more. So it's a really great way for people to become empowered, to understand their own choices, to make their own choices, and that ultimately always leads to sustainability. And when we're talking about diet, lifestyle, being healthy, being sustainable and being consistent is typically often the primary factor. So I think that's really great. I don't have to tell people what to eat. I can tell them what they should think about eating. So definitely when I'm diabetic, or my diabetic mindset for today, if I'm gonna be making food, whether I'm at the store or making it or even buying it out, I'm gonna basically in my mind, or maybe even pull out my list of glycemic index foods and say, okay, this is not a good food, this is a good food, or I could even Google it and say, oh, I don't wanna eat that. It's got a really bad glycemic index. So I'm always thinking about glycemic index when I'm making my food. So I think that's really important. And again, glycemic index is very correlated to fiber. So I'm always looking for high fiber foods. And if I can't eat carbs that are high in fiber, I'm going to find fiber to pair with it. So if I know I'm gonna have some pasta, I wanna have a bigger salad. If I know I'm gonna have some pasta, I wanna find some type of a food that has more fiber in it. Or they even make certain types of brown wheat pasta or brown rice pasta, which has higher fiber. So those are some examples. The next thing I'm always thinking about when I look at my food is how processed is it? And so basically the more processed a food is, the faster it's gonna absorb into the blood, and the more it's gonna spike the blood sugar. And that begins to make sense because typically when we process something, what we're really doing is we're stripping away the fiber. So if you think about brown rice versus white rice, the difference why it's white is there's no more fiber, they pulled it off. If we talk about whole wheat bread, which is typically brown, versus white bread, which is obviously white, again, the reason why it's white is we strip the fiber out. So typically when we process a food, or when we talk about processed foods, we're talking about foods that have had the fiber reduced or removed. So now we can again begin to intuitively understand that it's the fiber in a lot of cases that are making something healthy or not healthy. And now once you understand that, you can then begin to ask your own questions. Is this food healthy or not? Well, I can ask how much fiber is in it. If it's high in fiber, it's probably good. If it's low in fiber, it's probably bad. And if it's low in fiber and I want to eat it anyways, I can find something else that's high in fiber to offset that. So again, I'm not telling you what to eat. I'm telling you how to think, how to look at the food so you can make your own decisions, which is, I think, a novel approach here. And it also definitely applies to junk food, which we all know. The worst example is going to be soda. First of all, I don't think anyone thinks there's fiber in soda. So obviously there's no fiber in soda. There's also no protein and no fat. So there's really nothing in there to help slow the absorption. It's completely processed. And when sugar is in liquid form, it always absorbs the fastest. So if you wanted to diabolically create something that was going to cause the most massive increase in blood sugar, it basically would be soda because it's processed. There's nothing to slow the absorption. So that's a really good example. And again, we can understand a little bit now why maybe junk food is bad for us, because junk food we most know is processed, has no fiber, typically has no protein, and if it has fats, it's typically unsaturated fats, or saturated fats, which aren't healthy, or trans fats, which are even worse. So again, that junk food doesn't check any of these boxes. So I think that's a really great way to look at it to help you understand that. The other two factors of a food or a meal that can also help slow the absorption or the breakdown of the carbs is going to be protein and fat. So protein is a really great way to delay the digestion, which again is another way of saying it takes longer to absorb. And like we already said on this prior slide here, the longer it takes to absorb, the lower the peak, the lower the postprandial, and the quicker we get back to normal. So again, this top one is the red line's junk food, and the green line is something that's really high in fiber, high in fat, high in protein. It just doesn't really peak very high, and it very quickly goes back to normal, just to again illustrate that. Some of the other benefits of the protein is it's going to slow the emptying. So again, if you're going to feel fuller for longer, which means you're going to eat less and eat less often, which is great from a weight management standpoint and also a blood sugar standpoint. Because if you eat every 2 hours versus you eat every 5 or 6 hours, typically the more frequency is going to increase the blood sugar. Another really cool point is that protein actually can naturally stimulate GLP-1. A lot of people probably are familiar with that term. That's basically what Ozempic is, Wegovy, all these miracle semaglutide, miracle drugs for weight loss. They are GLP-1 agonists. And so basically when we eat protein, we get a little bit of benefit of that. And again, it makes sense because we feel fuller for longer, it delays the absorption, and it lowers the peak, which is what GLP-1s do. Protein can also promote insulin secretion. So we talked about in the beginning that typically pre-diabetic or diabetic patients don't make enough insulin. So again, this helps us make a little bit more, which is obviously in our favor. And again, I already mentioned the fact that if you're feeling increased fullness, you're gonna eat less. So that's really great. And what's also cool about the protein is it's not a carb. So not only does it do all those benefits, but itself doesn't contribute to the blood sugar. So it's got a lot of benefits and not a lot of downsides. I'll just say quickly, some diabetics worry about eating too much protein from a kidney standpoint. I want to say that typically you have to be eating 75, 100 grams of protein or more a day for that to occur. And typically, I think the protein isn't that big of a factor. I think typically when you have really uncontrolled diabetes and it damages the kidney, or you have really uncontrolled high blood pressure and it damages the kidney, that's then when protein becomes a concern. But I personally, to my understanding, don't think protein by itself is going to cause those issues. It's going to be the uncontrolled blood sugar or the uncontrolled blood pressure that's going to cause the kidney issue. So I definitely think for almost everybody out there, unless you have diagnosed kidney disease, 50 to 75 grams of protein a day, no problem, it's not going to be an issue. So that's important. And then fats, like we already kind of mentioned, similar to protein, they can delay the absorption of the carbs. They do also increase some of the hormones. In this case, it's GIP. So if you're familiar with the weight loss drugs, you have Ozempic and Wegovy on one side. You have Mounjaro and Zepbound on the other side. The Mounjaro and the Zepbound are GIPs. So actually, if you have protein and fat, you're mimicking the mechanisms of two different weight loss medications, which I think is a really cool concept. And I think further illustrates why protein and fat makes a difference. They also have some data suggests that unsaturated fats have more benefit. That kind of, again, makes sense. Unsaturated fats are typically the healthier fats. Coconut oil is a good example of that one. So for quick aside, I do like to eat waffles, maybe once or twice. We'll probably, maybe not once a week, but pretty close to once a week, especially when I'm training. If I'm gonna go run 10 miles, I'm definitely gonna have some waffles. So what I will do is I'll put a bunch of coconut oil on my waffle because I know that that's really high in unsaturated fat, and it's actually going to delay the absorption of the carbs. So it's a really great example. Again, I'm diabetic, I'm going to go train, or I just love waffles. I want to have some waffles. How do I do that in a more safe or beneficial way? I'm going to pair it with fats. So I put a bunch of coconut oil on it, and it really helps that absorption slow down, which is a really great example. What I also will do, again, if I'm diabetic, I'll eat some eggs with it. So I typically never eat pancakes or waffles without eggs, because those eggs provide protein, they provide fat, and they further delay the absorption. So kind of taking a step back, like I keep saying, I like to eat waffles every once in a while, so I always make sure I have fat and I have protein to help that absorption. And then what I actually do now is I mix almond flour with the Bisquick, although I don't use Bisquick brand flour. And again, I'm increasing the fiber content and the protein content. So it's a great illustration for me, that's why I keep saying waffles, is that I can actually increase the fiber, increase the protein, and increase the fat all separately in that meal. And the kicker is after that meal, I typically almost always have a whey protein shake to further increase the protein content. So those are some really great thought process examples. If you have a food that you like that's not good for you, what you can do around that food to help it have less of an impact. Again, if I'm gonna be eating pasta for dinner, maybe I'm gonna go run or I'm gonna go ride my bike the next day and I'm slightly carb loading, I'm definitely gonna have a lean protein with it. I'm definitely gonna have a really large salad with it. And I'm also gonna eat a smaller portion of the carbs or a reasonable portion of the carbs. So again, I'm controlling it. And then I may even take a few little nuts or pistachios afterwards just to further increase the fat. So anytime I'm eating a high carb meal or eating a high carb meal that has maybe not the best glycemic index, I'm always asking myself, how can I add fiber? How can I add protein? How can I add fat? And definitely a protein one's easy because you can always take away a protein supplement afterwards. So I think there's definitely a lot of ways you can do that to give you some flexibility. You can just Google what are high protein foods, what are high fat healthy foods, avocados, great example, what are high fiber foods, and incorporate those into those meals. So I think that's really, when it comes to food, the number one thing that I'm thinking about as a diabetic is how do I increase the fat, fiber, and protein, because all those things are going to lower my peak, my blood sugar, and then again, learning to identify what is processed and staying away from that. If it's processed, I don't want it. If there's no fat, fiber, or protein in it, it's just carbs, I typically don't want it. So I think that's a really powerful concept that a lot of people don't understand. That there's a lot of benefit there to people. And again, I'm not really telling you what to eat, I'm giving you that thought process so you can customize your own approach and find something that works better for you, because that's how you're gonna be sustainable and successful. There's just one other point on this slide that I wanted to go over again too, which is portion size. So the way I'm gonna explain it here is if you're eating a healthy food, eat a lot of it. If you're eating an unhealthy food, eat a smaller portion. So portion size is a big concept, but I think we can also use it here, where if I'm eating really processed foods or really high carbohydrate foods, I wanna eat a really big portion of protein or fiber, and I wanna try to minimize that carb as much as I can. So maybe I don't need to eat 2 waffles, maybe I can eat 1 waffle. Maybe I don't need to eat 3 hot dogs, I can eat 2 hot dogs. Anytime that I can decrease that portion size of that unhealthy food, it's gonna help me. Just like every time I pair it with a fat, fiber, or protein containing food, it's also gonna help. And if I start doing multiple of those things at once consistently, it adds up over time. So that's really how I'm thinking about it. Portion size, fat, fiber, protein, not processed, glycemic index. And again, when I put all those things together, it really empowers me to make some better decisions. So just to kind of wrap that up, again, I hope now we can kind of begin to understand some examples of why soda is bad, because it's just completely processed with nothing else in it. But also things like chips, junk food, and candy. Again, they have no fiber, they have no protein, they either have no fat or they have no unhealthy fat, it's just carbs. Versus beans are high in fiber, high in protein. Lean meats, again, high in fat, high in protein. Vegetables typically have really low glycemic index for those carbs. They take a long time to absorb. And something like fats to pair with a meal or on a meal on its own have very little carbs, are high in fat, have a good amount of protein, and typically have a good amount of fiber. So combining those things or those ingredients, we can now begin to see that contrast between the junk food and the healthy food. So I think that's a really great point or example. Again, if you're just joining us, we are still live. So if you have any questions, put that in the feed. The goal here is to give personalized information. So if you are following along live and you have any questions, put those in the chat and we will address those specifically. I do also, before I go on to the next subject, to finish off with food, I want to talk about another thing is the ORAC value. So again, that's the oxygen radical absorbent capacity. It's a fancy word for how many antioxidants are in it. So if you can also find yourself a food list that has high ORAC value, that's another great way of finding foods. Same thing with finding a food list that's high in fiber is really important. And then I also want to say that if you can't see what you're eating in nature, it's probably processed. So like you're not going to see a can of soda in nature. You're not going to see a hamburger bun in nature. You're just not going to see it. But you'll see carrots, you'll see apples, you'll see oranges, you'll see beans, you'll see nuts. You can kind of see things like fish and cows and chickens. So that's also another really simple way of asking myself, should I be eating this? So I'll also think about that as a diabetic. Does this occur naturally in nature? And if it doesn't, either I shouldn't eat it, I should minimize the portion size, or I need to pair it with something else, just another strategy. And if you do all those things together, it definitely will have a major impact on your blood sugar. So the other part about diet that I want to kind of mention here, because again, like I said, diabetes is a disease of diet, is plan in advance. This is really the next phase. So phase 1 is figuring out what we just talked about. Phase 2 typically is how do I plan in advance. Now I know what I need, now I know what I like, now that I know it's good for me, the next thing is making that more consistent, more frequent, which means planning in advance. Also want to include that it's not that easy to buy pre-made food that's healthy. They put a lot of random ingredients in things, which do really weird random things, but it kind of makes sense because their job is to sell you food you like to make you come back. So if the food doesn't taste good, they're not really going to stay in business for very long. So they have a huge incentive to make food that tastes good, which typically is not necessarily food that's super healthy, or oftentimes they cheat and they use sweeteners or preservatives or sauces with 9 or 10 different ingredients in it, which are not healthy for you. So again, pre-made food is typically an issue. Again, nobody's perfect. Sometimes we have to do what we have to do. A couple of weeks ago, I had to go buy some food, and I basically bought what I would describe as a vegetable and chicken burrito. There was really not a lot in it. I was really shocked. There wasn't a lot of sauce. The ingredients seemed pretty good to me. The tortilla seemed not like an issue. And yet I had one of the biggest blood sugar or blood glucose level spikes I've ever seen in myself. I was wearing the CGM at the time, and I'm not going to share what value I went to, but it was really high. And I was like, wow, I'm really shocked right now. I thought this was a relatively healthy food, and so I was really surprised by that. So it's another great example of one, how if you have that data, you're going to notice things that maybe you would miss. And 2, that even when you buy pre-made food out that seems healthy, sometimes it's not. And I was, again, in my own experience, shocked with that. Also want to include the idea that buying pre-made food is typically expensive. So not only is it not great for you or potentially bad for you, but it's also expensive. And that's also money that you could be spending elsewhere. So it's going to make your diabetes, your blood sugar worse, and it's going to basically cause you to spend the money in a bad way versus being able to spend that money on a gym membership or health insurance or at the pharmacy or supplements or personal training or therapy, whatever it is. You're kind of wasting your money on unhealthy pre-made food in a way that's just really not going to help you. So I also want to, again, include the solution to that is meal prep or food prep. So again, you can make a list of low glycemic index foods and then find the ones you like, get a list of high ORAC foods and then find the ones you like, and then meal prep. So what I've been doing lately is I make some salads. I got a cool dicer. So I just put the vegetables or the produce in the dicer and I just push it through and it falls into the bottom and it's basically ready to make a salad. So I'll put some cabbage, carrots, celery, lentils, a little bit of hummus, a little bit of chicken. It takes me like 5 minutes. It's really easy. And it probably cost me, $3 or $4. Instead if I go and buy a salad, it's like $18. So I just saved myself like $15 in a day that I can use to go buy supplements or therapy, whatever it is. So I think that's really the best way to go about it is, again, find those list of foods, find the foods you like, and then a couple days a week you can prep them. So Sunday night, Wednesday night, pick 2 or 3 days a week and just make a couple portions. Buy some cheap Tupperware that doesn't have BPA in it and you're good to go. And it's probably going to be the single best way you can reduce your blood sugar because it's typically that meal that you eat out that's going to be probably the worst for your blood sugar, which is why, again, planning in advance is typically phase 2, because once we plan in advance, we have more control over things, especially the amounts, both for the portions and the calories, but also things like fiber, protein, fat, and the types of carbs. So I think that's a really great advice for people. We're kind of going a little long here. I was trying to keep this around 30 minutes, but I'm just going to keep going. So the next one's going to be exercise. So I will say that you need to do as much of this as you can. There's, in some sense, no such thing as too much exercise. Obviously, if you're doing 4 or 5 hours a day, you're doing 20 or 30 hours a week, okay, maybe that's a little excessive. It might be an overtraining type thing, but for most people, there's no such thing as too much. It's got a major, major benefit. Some of the examples would be it increases your insulin sensitivity, so the insulin you have works better. Again, we mentioned earlier that diabetes is defined as being insulin resistance. Sensitivity is the opposite of resistance, so it moves us in the opposite direction, which is good. The other thing is that sensitivity can be, for increased sensitivity, can be for up to as long as 72 hours. So it's not just like today and the now that exercise helps, but for the next couple days, it could benefit in lowering my blood sugar. So that's really important to understand. And that's why they typically recommend diabetics exercise at least 3 days a week, because if you do it spaced out, that's basically every 72 hours. So if you've ever heard that recommendation before and you were curious where 72 hours came from, that's typically where it comes from. Exercise also increases our metabolism, and it increases the nutrients our body needs. So if I am very sedentary, I don't do a lot, and I eat food, my body doesn't need it, it's gonna store it, I'm gonna gain weight, or it's gonna hang around in my blood sugar, keep my blood sugar elevated. But if I go and run 5 or 10 miles, you better believe my body is hungry, the metabolism is very elevated, and when I eat, all that nutrition is gonna go typically into my muscles and my body, which pulls out the blood sugar. So again, the more we increase our metabolism and more we increase the metabolic demand of our body, it typically causes that food or those nutrients to shift into the cells and then not linger in the blood. So again, we're pulling the sugar out of the blood, which obviously is gonna lower it. Exercise can also increase the amount of glycogen our body can store. So glycogen is another place that carbs can go. So the more glycogen we can make, we're basically gonna pull the carbs or the sugar out of the blood. So again, that's another way to lower the blood sugar. So there's 3 examples of how exercise can actually lower your blood sugar, which I think is important to be mindful of. And again, this is why it's so important, something you should be doing basically every day. I ideally recommend everybody who's serious about being healthy or serious about not getting sick, you wanna go out and walk for 20 to 30 minutes a day. That's definitely a really good piece of advice. When people ask me, how fast should I walk? It's a great question. A lot of people will say, if you can have a conversation while you're walking, you're not walking fast enough. So if you're someone who's trying to do moderate level activity, if you can have a conversation, you're not walking fast enough. If you're someone who's trying to take it easy, maybe you're a little bit older, you have an injury, you don't want to overdo it, you're just getting back into shape. If you can't talk, you're probably walking too fast. So you may want to walk at a pace where you can have a conversation and use that to guide the rate at which you'd be walking, just to kind of throw that in there. Why this also matters is that exercise improves your circulation, and it definitely improves the health of the blood vessels. And we talked about in other videos that basically the #1 complication of diabetes is cardiovascular disease. But when we take it a step further, it's really the inner lining of the blood vessels being damaged. So anything that improves the circulation, anything that improves the health of the blood vessels is the #1 thing we need to really focus on from a diabetes complication standpoint. So not only does exercise help lower the blood sugar, but also improves the function of our cardiovascular system. So it's got multiple benefits. And again, also exercise will typically help you lose weight. We talked about earlier about how being obese typically is a risk factor for diabetes or can make it worse. So there's 3 different benefits that exercise can give us here, just to provide some examples. And we have talked about many times before about how cardiovascular disease is a leading cause of death for diabetics. So if you are diabetic, cardiovascular disease has got to be probably your second primary focus after keeping your diabetes and your blood sugar in control, because most likely the major health issue you're going to have as a diabetic is going to be cardiovascular related. Also want to include real quick that exercise can help reduce your stress and provide a break from your life. Stress is ubiquitous in this world. I don't think anybody is free of stress. And if they think they are, they're probably mistaken. We all need to have something to reduce our stress levels, so exercise is a great way to do that. And stress has also been shown to increase blood sugar. Talk about that on the next slide. So again, another big benefit there. It provides a nice break from your life. The other one that's really great about exercise, just to kind of hype it up a little bit more, is it does keep your muscles strong, which from an aging standpoint and having a higher quality of life when you're older is really important. It's pretty hard to build or maintain muscles as you get older. And so the more you do now, you'll benefit that later. And so I think that's really important. Falls are basically the #1 cause of health issues for your average senior. And so the more you walk, the stronger you are, less likely you are to fall. Kind of already talked about stress real quickly, but stress does actually increase the blood sugar. It increases a fancy word called gluconeogenesis, which is basically how the liver makes blood sugar or sugar for the blood. So that basically increases that. So when you're stressed, your liver makes more sugar. At the same time, when you're stressed, it makes the body less sensitive to insulin because a part of stress is fight or flight, and your body thinks it may need to go run away from a tiger. So it wants to make sure there's plenty of energy in the blood to do that. So it turns out stress directly increases blood sugar. Another point to be mindful of is that when you're really stressed out, some people tend to kind of stress eat or comfort food eat, and those comfort foods typically aren't very healthy. So the more stressed you are, it can oftentimes impact your diet. Being stressed may also impact your ability to exercise, unfortunately, which is especially sad because the more stressed you are, the more you should exercise. Yet when we look in reality, it's typically the opposite. The more stressed you are, the less you exercise. Stress also impacts your ability to think clearly. So if we're trying to look at our food and make decisions, look at our diet and make decisions, or improve our life, obviously that's not good. And then also stress can impact our sleep. So again, exercise can basically reduce stress and it helps all those things. And also, if you become sleep deprived, it also can make your blood sugar potentially worse. Also, again, just want to touch on, we kind of talked about this, again, complications, but this is more so how I'm thinking about it. So again, I'm always worried about complications as being a diabetic. So again, I just kind of want to go through these slides real quick just to kind of emphasize that. So I'm always exercising as a diabetic. Ideally, if I can, I want to be able to go for a walk for 10 or 20 minutes in the morning and then go for 20 or 30 minutes at night. And if I'm able to go walk after my lunch, because anytime I go for a walk after a meal, it's going to lower my blood sugar. And if I can do it multiple times a day, even better. And the more I exercise, the more it's going to help lower my blood sugar. Also give me that stress benefit. So as a diabetic, every morning I make time and I go walk for 20 minutes. And then every evening after dinner, typically I go and walk for 20 minutes. It's one of the best ways I can help minimize my blood sugar from those things I mentioned. But it also helps with my stress. I'm very worried about being diabetic. Being diabetic is very stressful. It can be very scary. So all those things can cause stress, and life is already stressful enough. So I'm always trying to ask myself how I can minimize my stress. I do journaling. I may talk to myself about how I feel to process my feelings. I may call somebody. I may read some videos or watch something on YouTube. But I'm always trying to minimize my stress as a diabetic because I know diabetes and stress go hand in hand. And the more I can reduce my stress, it will have a benefit for my blood sugar. And again, I'm also always worried about complications, primarily cardiovascular disease. So I'm always asking myself, is my blood pressure good? Can it be better? When was the last time I measured it? What's my cholesterol or my LDL? I got to be asking myself those questions, but also not eating a bunch of processed foods or processed meats, which probably aren't going to be very great for my cholesterol. I'm trying to avoid those. I'm also making sure I'm exercising a lot because exercise is one of the best ways to prevent cardiovascular disease. Probably, I guess I wouldn't say the first best way or the number one best way, but probably number two. Anecdotally, what I have always told people is when I talk to patients and I ask them my blood pressure, every athlete or cyclist I talk to, their blood pressure is 115 over 60 or 65. They also have a heart rate of between 50 to 60 without much exception. So definitely the number one way probably to reduce cardiovascular risk is exercise. So I'm always thinking about that. I definitely want to know what my A1C is. And so I'm always, either pricking my finger, wearing my CGM, or getting my A1C measured twice a year. That's really beneficial. And again, if I need to or if I have the ability to, I'm wearing a CGM. And also my weight management. I'm always trying to make sure I'm not gaining weight, looking at myself in the mirror, making sure I don't see anything that looks too different, maybe weighing myself a couple times a month, or if I look in the mirror and I see something different, weighing myself. I don't personally like recommending weighing yourself every day. I don't think that's productive, but definitely knowing that. And those are really going to be the four biggest driving factors about complications. So again, as a diabetic, you have to worry about complications. It's really a disease of complications, and so you want to be mindful of that. So I'm always thinking about that. Do I check my blood pressure today? Am I eating healthy fats? Making sure my cholesterol is not going out of control. Am I exercising? Am I measuring my blood sugar? Am I managing my weight? Always thinking about those things as a diabetic. So that's really important. And again, especially where you are in the diagnosis process, because what happens is a lot of people, when they get diagnosed, they already have those issues. They already have a neurological issue. They already have a cardiovascular disease issue. They already have a muscle issue. And so they especially need to really focus on those on a daily basis because they're already impaired or lacking in those. And it's going to be even harder for them to fix those. And then also mood, because being sick or having a lifelong health issue definitely affects your mood. So I'm always trying to be proactive and checking myself, did I exercise today? No. Am I feeling a little down? Yeah. Okay, I need to go exercise. Because not only is it going to help my exercise activity and my cardiovascular function, but it's also going to boost my mood. or if I notice that I'm starting to get a little sad, a little depressed, I need to talk to somebody, I need to journal, I need to do something to process my feelings. I'm always asking myself about these complications of being diabetic and how I'm feeling on a daily basis. So I think the last thing that I have here, and then we'll be done, is how I apply this kind of in a more global sense for me personally, again, both as a person, as a potential diabetic. If I had a cheat meal today, or had a cheat meal yesterday, eating more junk food today is not a good idea. So I always tell people it's okay to eat some junk food every once in a while. You have to be happy and healthy and sustainable and all that. And if you have a diet that you don't like, it's not going to really be very long lasting. So it's okay to have a cheat meal, but if you have a cheat meal, don't do it multiple days in a row or multiple times in the same day. So that's a really important thing that I apply. If I have ice cream, the next day I definitely eat extra healthy. I exercise even more. I may even do an intermittent fast for the first half of the day, just to allow my body to process those calories and those ingredients instead of storing them. I think that's a really good thing that I'm always thinking about. Again, if I have a cheat meal, then I definitely want to eat something healthy. So if I know it's my birthday, I'm going to go out and do whatever I want. Eating the healthiest meal for lunch that day or going and exercise on my lunch break that day is going to be a really good idea. So I think that's an important concept. And then what I may do is I may intermittent fast the next day. So if I ate, a couple slices of cake, I had some ice cream, I had some pizza, I had some alcohol, I had a lot of stuff. It was my birthday. I may actually do a 16-hour fast the next day to help, again, utilize what I have and avoid putting more in, which is going to help with the blood sugar standpoint. I also like to keep a mental list of what I eat. So again, the more healthy food I eat, the more occasionally I can eat bad food. So if I have a really, really, really stellar diet that's completely dialed in, if I want to have a cheat meal every once in a while, it's probably not going to have much of an impact. But if I'm eating a lot of unhealthy foods, that's definitely not the time to have cheat meals. And instead, I need to be looking for something to offset it. So if I've been eating really healthy, I want to increase my exercise, increase my fiber, increase my protein, maybe do a fast, do something to kind of offset it or balance it. So I'm allowing myself that flexibility, but I've also figured out a way to kind of compensate for it and decrease the consequences of bad decisions or cheat meals. And then again, if you are someone who's wearing a CGM, you can also use that to make small decisions. So again, I said earlier, instead of eating 2 waffles, I'll eat 1 waffle. Instead of eating 2 slices of cake, I'll eat 1 slice of cake or half of a slice of cake, whatever it may be. So when you have that data with that CGM, a lot of times it helps you kind of fine tune those decisions where it's like, I didn't need to eat all of that, and eating all of that was really bad for me. So that motivates me to eat a little bit smaller of a portion, and it makes a bad situation a little bit better. So I think that's important. And I also want to include, again, you obviously have to take medications if you need that, and if you're on medications, you need a system. You have to have some way of organizing and keeping track of it. Just telling yourself you remember to take it every single day is probably not the best bet. So you can use a pill organizer, you can have a calendar, you can have an alarm, but typically you need to mark it down somewhere, have a routine. I do it every morning, I do it every evening, before dinner, after dinner, whatever it may be. I have an alarm, I have an app. You need something, you need some system. That's really important because you need to have a consistent pattern. If you're not consistent with your routine and your pattern, you're going to be more likely to miss doses. Also want to include to be mindful of side effects. So if you know it causes urinary issues, if you're making prone to being low on your blood sugar, dizzy, confused, weight gain, whatever it may be, you want to be mindful of those things with your medications. And then also you need to know your treatment goals. So if your A1C is increasing, you add another medication, you go get your A1C measured again, your A1C still increases, there's something going on there. Maybe you're not taking your medication properly, maybe it's not being dosed properly, but definitely if you're not reaching your treatment goals, there's going to be something to be said about the medication in terms of it not being used properly or being taken properly by the patient, and that's a conversation to have with your doctor. So that's really what I have for you guys today. Again, the real idea here is that I want to help people understand how to think about their decisions, and so I'm trying to kind of frame this conversation as if I was a diabetic, how I would think about things. So the number one thing when I'm a diabetic and I'm thinking about it is I want to minimize the peak and minimize the postprandial. And the easiest ways to do that are increasing my fiber, increasing my protein, increasing my fat, and decreasing how processed things are. Using things like glycemic index and food lists and ORAC values to find really healthy, carb-friendly foods. Also thinking about things like portion size. So if what I'm about to eat is not good for me, I'm gonna eat less of it. In the case of the waffles, I use a lot of coconut oil to help offset that. I also eat some whey protein and eat some eggs to help offset that, so that's important. Using exercise as a tool. So exercise can lower my blood sugar, so I make sure I do exercise once or twice a day. If I'm gonna have a really big meal, I wanna exercise afterwards. And I'm always using exercise to kind of maintain my blood sugar and keep it where I want it to be. So that's really important. I'm also trying to be mindful of the complications, whether it's stress, blood pressure, gaining weight. I'm always thinking about those things and making sure the decisions I'm making on a daily basis are in line with those. Because those 4 values, blood pressure, blood sugar, cholesterol, and weight or BMI, are probably the 4 biggest drivers of my health as a diabetic. So I should always be asking myself, is this making it better, worse, or the same? And if I'm consistently making those decisions and make it worse, I should probably be reevaluating those. And the same thing with cheat meals. It's totally okay to have a cheat meal every once in a while. Just make sure when you have a cheat meal, you don't do it multiple times in the same day or multiple times in the same week. If you're gonna have a cheat meal, try to put really healthy foods before and after it to kind of balance it out. Increase your exercise especially, and maybe even consider doing something like intermittent fast afterwards to help offset that. And then again, if you're taking medication, definitely have a system, because medication doesn't work if you don't take it. It doesn't work as well if you take it improperly. So it's also really important to make sure you're taking it correctly. And if you're not achieving your treatment goals, you need to talk to your doctor, and that requires you to collect data, be mindful and pay attention, and know what those treatment goals are. So that you can say, you know what, I'm going in the wrong direction, I'm gaining weight, my blood sugar is going up, my blood pressure is going up, something's not right here, I need to do something about it. So that's what I have for you guys today. I hope you guys like that. Again, my name is Chris, I'm the Helpful Pharmacist, and I am really trying to help people understand how to improve their health. I'm not here to tell you what to do. Instead, I want to give you guys some food for thought to help you make better decisions that are more in line with what matters to you. And so instead of you having instructions to follow about eat A, B, and C, I'm going to give you more of a thought process and you can make your own decisions. So if you like the information, please subscribe to the channel or like the video or both. If you have any questions, put those in the comments, or you can also reach me at welcome@yourpersonalpharmacy.net. If you have any pharmacy questions, we have some great information at yourpersonalpharmacy.net. We have a really extensive FAQ section. And if you're looking for supplements, definitely check out our shop tab. We have a really nice pharmacist curated inventory selection where I basically make a list of all the supplements I think are best for people, whether it's the proper brand, the proper product, and I do a lot of the research for you. And also, if you have any other questions, feel free to contact me. And if you are looking for a new pharmacy in the San Diego County area, definitely give me a call or send me an email. I'm more than happy to explain to you what we do and why it's different. So again, my name is Chris. I am a biochemist and a pharmacist. I'm the Helpful Pharmacist. Thank you for watching, and definitely keep subscribing because there's a lot more information to come. Thank you and have a great day.